It's the time of year where gardens are in full swing. Our cucumbers have been producing 30 to 40 per week. So while we love them fresh, it's time to share my favorite way to keep the flavor of the summer all year long. I'd love for you to hang out today as I share my favorite pickle recipe, plus try out a new tool for food preservation. Yesterday, when I went out to the garden, I had a huge haul. And today, I grabbed a few more as well, and I wanted to show you exactly what I do to get these cucumbers ready for pickling. The first step is to get them brined. Now, the pot I'm about to pull out are the cucumbers that I started yesterday. They've been setting at least 12 hours and can go up to 3 days before needing to be pulled out and pickled, following the recipe that I will link for you below. The brine that the cucumbers soak in is just purified or clean water through my Berkey filter, as well as Redmond sea salt. Again, the exact measurements for that will be down in the description below, but this allows you to continually add pickles for a few days if you're needing to, in order to have enough to get a round accomplished. Before the cucumbers go into the brine, it's really important to give them a good rinse and to find some way to remove all of the little prickly spikes that are left on your cucumbers if you're using one that is prone to that. I am using the Monica cucumber from rareseeds.com, and it is rather spiky, so I definitely always wear gloves when I'm pulling them off the vine, and then make sure to use this mesh washcloth, just rubbing in the opposite direction of the growth, and it really removes anything on there that is not smooth and comfortable to handle. We swapped to these cucumbers last year after having some pest problems with the one I had been using previously, and these turned out really, very prolific. They don't need any pollinators, and they're very drought and heat resistant, which is one of the reasons that I wanted to give them a go. Our summers get pretty warm here in Southwest Missouri, and it can be really tough to get cucumbers enough water to keep going. So I will tell you right now, it is the beginning of July, and I have an insane amount of cucumbers out on the vines right now. So far, so good. These did well for us last year, but they are doing even better this spring. The only other prep that I do to the cucumbers before adding them to the brine to go into the fridge is to make sure to cut off the very end. I usually cut off around 1/8 to 1/4 inch of the blossom end, and this helps to keep the cucumber a little more crisp and make sure that your pickles turn out crispy as well. Now I'm preparing the actual pickling brine that is going to go into the jars once they're full. This starts out with 8 cups of water. And again, you saw that I pulled that from my Berkey filter, making sure that it's free of anything that could contaminate the jars, also keeping it clean and pure from fluoride and chlorine. So that is really important to me, to making sure I'm getting the cleanest product possible. I'm also adding 6 cups of 5% vinegar. This is not a situation where you want to use a raw vinegar, because it's the acidity in the vinegar that's helping to keep the product shelf stable. In addition to the vinegar and water, this brine does call for some sugar. Now, this is a dill pickle, but just a little bit of sugar can go a long way. The recipe calls for 1/4 cup. My husband likes them a little less sweet, so I do add about half of that, going with about 1/8 cup of sugar. Then 1/2 cup salt, and a tablespoon of pickling spices. Now, that's something you can pick up at the store, or you can make your own, which is what I chose to do. I keep most of the ingredients for pickling spices on hand, so it's easy just to blend up what you need. I typically will make up a 1/2 pint jar at the beginning of the season, and that amount will last me through the remainder of the year. If you're interested in our pickling spice recipe, I'll make sure to link that below as well, so you can go check that one out. Now, while the brine is coming up to temperature, you want to bring it almost to a boil, or right at a boil, and then get it back down to a simmer. But while that's going on, you need to go ahead and start the water for your canning pot. Now, if you don't have a water bath canner, you really don't have to go buy one. You can use any stock pot that you have, as long as it's deep enough to get a couple inches of water over the top of whatever size jar you're using. This large pot has become a huge workhorse in my kitchen, and I'm really glad that I decided to go with just a large stock pot instead of a specific water bath canner, just for the flexibility and versatility that it's added to our kitchen. Now, I also did add a wire rack into the bottom to lift up those jars so they could properly process. And you saw me putting a thermometer in the water. That's really important because we're doing a low temperature pasteurization on these pickles. So they need to reach 180 degrees and stay there for 30 complete minutes. So some sort of thermometer is necessary. You don't want to reach too high in your temperature, but you want to make sure it gets just into the right zone. So that thermometer is very, very important to our overall process. This low temperature pasteurization is what helps to keep the pickles crispy and prevents them from getting soggy by being over temperature through a regular boiling water bath. This is approved as a safe canning method with this specific recipe following the directions down below. So that is something that you can be sure of. This one is good to go. Now, speaking of canning safety, what you're seeing me do now is wash up my jars. I'm using some warm soapy water just to make sure to get the jars completely clean before adding our product. Now, I did wash these jars before I put them away, but they've been sitting on my shelf for quite a while, so it's really important to make sure that they're clean. A great alternative to hand washing is simply to run them through your dishwasher, so just do what works for you and whatever you have time for. It was time for a quick switch here, so I got rid of the soapy water, cleaned up everything that I had made a mess of, and swapped out for my colander so I could pull those cucumbers out of the brine and get them cleaned off and rinsed and ready to go into the jars. Now, as you can see there, I had an additional colander sitting on top of my pan here full of the cucumbers, and that was to keep them pressed down underneath the brine. You do not want these floating, so that gave them a little bit of weight. You can also just use a plate or a heavy bowl if you don't have a colander that is the same size as your pan, but if you do have that available, it's a really nice way just to push everything down in there. I pulled out a good portion of the cucumbers that I had available, but I went ahead and left some in the water because I knew what I had was more than one round of pickling. Now here I'm taking the ones that I picked this morning. You can see me cutting off that blossom end that I mentioned before, and I'm putting them back into that same pot of salt water. I reused mine a few times before I change it out. Remember, I just picked my first round yesterday, so this is 1 day old salt water. It can definitely handle another round. Once the blossom end is cut off and the cucumbers are back in the pot submerged under the colander so they're down in the water, I put them back in the refrigerator and they will be there until I'm ready to go again for the next round. With that complete, I'm going to pull out the new device that I mentioned earlier to help me out with food preservation. This is a newhai food processor. It does meat grinding, juicing, vegetable cutting, and also really grades cheese really nicely. So I wanted to try it out and see if I could speed up some of the processes that come about during the preservation season. Now, typically I just take a knife and run through my pickles to make the size of slices that I wanted, but I wanted to try a couple different blades here. One, to just give the machine a test and see what I thought of the product. But secondly, because I want to see what I can do to speed up and maximize the time that I have in the kitchen. When I first opened this food processor, I was really amazed with the number of pieces that came with it. It can be a bit overwhelming, but the directions were so detailed that when I took a look at it, I realized this was really, really simple to use, and it solved one of my biggest complaints about my regular food processor, which is the hard to clean bowl with the hole in the middle where when I pull it out to go dump it, some of my cheese or whatever product I'm actually grating falls down in the center, making a big mess everywhere. With this, I can just put the bowl or device of my choice underneath, catch everything that I have coming out, and then the cleanup is just way easier. To get started, I am cutting off the stem end that is left on the cucumber and then simply turning on the machine and letting it go. Now, I did start with the wavy blade because I wanted to see if I could get a similar product to what you get in the store when you buy a hamburger sliced pickle. Now, these started coming out and there were a ton. If I had another one to put down on top, all of those would have just fallen right out of the device itself. But I just wanted to stop and take a look at what the product was actually looking like. So check out this slice. You can see it is pretty thin, but it gave a beautiful slice. And I was pretty happy with the way it turned out. But for science, I only ran a couple that way and decided to change up the blade just so I could experience what that was like and see if it was going to be a real pain. To do that, you simply turn the inside of the barrel, the whole black piece comes out, and then these blades just pop off. I was kind of like wondering if it was going to be difficult at all, but it's really not. So these two pop out, and then there are two more to pop in that have the regular, just a straight slice. There are also some shredding blades that come with it, a sausage stuffer, a meat grinder, and then, of course, the juicer, which I cannot wait to use on my tomato sauce, which will be coming in hot here in the next few weeks. So I think this is going to turn into a workhorse for me, but I will let you guys know what I think. As time goes on, it is sure to get a lot more use during the preservation season. The straight slices turned out really nicely, and I was super happy with the way they finished. But the other way that we like to do pickles around here is in slices and spears. So today what I did was I took the jar that I'm going to be putting these into and I measured how long they needed to be, cutting off the remainder to run it through and make additional slices. Now, once I got these cut in half, you're seeing I'm taking them and kind of wedging them so they're in little spears that the kids can easily pick up and handle when they want a pickle. This prevents them from needing a whole handful of slices at a time. They can use these spears just as a go-to snack and hopefully not have to shove their fingers all the way down into the jar to get what they want, because let's be honest, they don't always grab the fork like they're supposed to. The slice is complete. I went ahead and ran those final ends through the food processor machine to make sure that I got all of that accomplished before going ahead and getting it cleaned up. To dismantle it, it was as simple as a push of a button and spin. The whole thing came off, and then I was easily able to just clean it out and rinse it under the sink. There wasn't anything stuck in the device itself, so after a quick rinse, it really came together very nicely. Warm soapy water to wash it up completely, and then you are good to go. I'm not ready to say this is an absolute must-have for a food processing kitchen yet, but it definitely is helpful, and I think it will be super helpful once the tomatoes come into play. Now, at this point, the next step is just to go ahead and get your jars filled with the spices that they need before the cucumbers are added. Each jar is getting a teaspoon of mustard seeds, a teaspoon of dill seed, or you can add a sprig of fresh dill, and a clove of garlic. Once that's complete, all you have to do is stuff your jars. So I started out with the slices. There really is no rhyme or reason to it. You just want to make sure that you get them pressed in there pretty tightly, and you want to leave a 1/2 inch of headspace. If you are new to canning, headspace is the distance between the top of your food product and the top of the jar. I will show you exactly how to measure this out here in a moment, but I wanted to introduce the concept to those of you who might be new to the canning world. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is actually the very first thing that I ever canned. And the skills that I learned while doing this exact process have really transformed the way that I've taken care of and processed the food that comes into our kitchen moving forward. It is really easy to start out with a water bath product because it takes away the pressure, no pun intended, of the pressure canning process. And it really is just a great entry for those of you who might want to try out something new. So here is the brine that I've had simmering over on the stove. I have what's a canning funnel there on the top. This helps to make sure that all of the liquid goes down into your jar. So one ladle here is doing a really good job of filling up those initial jars with my slices because I packed them rather tightly. You'll see here in a moment, I need a little bit more liquid for my spears. One, I mismeasured them a little bit. They aren't quite as tall as they could have been. I also could have packed them a little tighter into the jars themselves, but the end result is only slightly changed because it just means you need to add a little bit more brine to the jars that are not quite as full as the actual canning product. Now here you're seeing me use what's called a debubbler. This little tool, which you could use like a wooden chopstick or something of the sort, you just want to try not to use metal because it can damage the jar. But it goes down there. You want to poke it in 4 or 5 different places and release any of the air pockets that are down inside the food. When you're packing something in rather tightly, like these pickles are, you can see how air could get trapped in there. And then during the canning process, that can impact the seal as that air rises to the top. Once all of the air bubbles are released, then you take and flip the debubbler over to the opposite end, and it has several little stair steps, as you can see up there at the top. Each of those stair steps is marked with a different measurement. Once selecting the right stair step, you just put it right on the edge, and then you can fill up the liquid until it barely touches the bottom of your measuring stick. That is the way to get your headspace exactly right every single time. Other people have different methods by measuring with the weight that the threads are on the jar itself. But for my own peace of mind, I like to just go ahead, use my little measuring tool. It was really, really inexpensive, and it just gives me the peace of mind that knowing I have all of the measurements just right. Once you've adjusted the headspace and made sure everything is appropriate, then I just take a vinegar on a paper towel, rub it around the top in order to make sure that the seals are completely clean. Since there is some sugar and other ingredients in there that could negatively impact the seal, this step is critically important. It's also super, super important if you're using a meat product, which you can't do water bath, but you can pressure can. Just all in, making sure to clean your rims is really important to the overall seal. You do not want to go through this entire process and come out with a jar that doesn't seal in the end. So make sure to clean those rims very thoroughly. Now, what you're seeing here is just a little bit of my obsessiveness. I am taking the jars, turning them to face forward and making sure that the label on top of my lids is also facing forward. You don't have to do that. I just really like to make sure everything looks really nice and organized on my shelf. I want the top of the jar and the writing to match up with a pretty picture on the front of the jar. So do yourself a favor and don't follow me in my obsessiveness, but just get those lids on there any way that you can. Once the flats are actually placed, then you move on to the rings. Now, this first ring that you're seeing me get ready to put on, it did not set on there smoothly, and I didn't feel like I could get it on there like I wanted. So I just immediately tossed it to the side. If you feel like you have one that's slightly dented at all or might not give you a good seal, do not waste your time with it. Just grab a different one. So as you can see here, I just put my finger on the top of the lid and then I spin the ring until it comes to a stop. I'm not twisting or cranking them on there, just holding the flat in place with one hand while twisting with the other until I meet a little bit of resistance. This is what's called finger tight. You're not cranking at all. And then I'm using a jar lifter to go ahead and put these into that hot simmering water that I have over on the stove. While the broth was heating and I've had this water going the whole time, I have it up to about 140 degrees based on my thermometer right now. Once all 6 jars are in there, then I'm going to raise the temperature of my water in order to get it up to that 180 before I can start the processing time of 30 minutes. With this method of low temperature pasteurization, your product will not reach a full boil. You're looking for that 180 to 185 mark for a sustained 30 minutes in order to ensure that your product is safe. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm in the kitchen and I am waiting on something for 30 minutes, it's time to take on another task, specifically because my kiddos are out enjoying the afternoon with my husband and I had some time alone to mark some things off the list. So I went ahead and grabbed out my big roaster oven and I am taking 10 pounds of ground beef and going ahead and getting it into that large roaster to allow it to cook all day. When I have meat that I can go ahead and brown up in advance, I can save some out just using it plain for things like spaghetti or any sort of meal that I need just a ground beef for. And then I can take the other and make it into taco meat. If you want to see more on my big bulk cooking days or big batch cooking days, I'll make sure to link a video for that at the end. But I can tell you when I do this and I need a meal at the last minute, I can have tacos on the table in 5 minutes flat when I just use a little bit of the spare moments that I have while accomplishing another project to get something like this going in the kitchen. After the pickles have had their full processing time, then you need to move on to next steps. Putting them out on a towel is super important, not only for the safety of your countertop, but for the safety of your jars. So make sure to grab a towel and use your tongs to go ahead and lift them out of the water. Don't tip them, even though you'll want to drain that water off the top. Just go ahead and set them out. That water will dry off soon enough, and you don't want to impact the seal. Once they're all out, let them set out for 12 hours on the countertop to completely cool, and then you can label them and put them on the shelf. Recipe and links to supplies in the comments, and that wraps us up for today. I'll see you back soon.